The silence of the machine was louder than any thunder I had ever known. It sat cold and heavy in the center of my studio. A polished steel monument to 30 years of sacrifice, of mended dreams, and of invisible labor. I had spent 7 months weaving that gown knot with ordinary silk. But with a structural composite, I developed myself a masterpiece of tension and support that breathed life into every curve. It was more than a wedding dress. It was a blueprint, a functional schematic of the physics of beauty. And it was the last desperate piece of my soul I offered to my daughter when Zuri looked at the ivory creation. Draped across the antique mahogany table, she didn't see the thousands of calculations, the engineered lattice of the lace, or the tear-stained hours of my life. She saw only the shadow of the seamstress, the ghost of the ghetto she had clawed her way out of. Her face, usually a mask of polished corporate ambition, crumpled into a sneer I would carry to my grave. "Mother," she whispered, the word coated in something colder than ice. This looks like it was built in the slums. My wedding is being covered by architectural digests, not a craft fair. I'm marrying into the Ellington dynasty. Do you genuinely expect me to stand next to my fiancé in a gown that screams? My mother makes curtains? She didn't touch it. That was the deepest wound. She let her contempt hover in the air, a chemical weapon targeting my pride. Her fiancé, a handsome, entitled boy named Ethan, stood slightly behind her, a perfectly sculpted figure of polite discomfort. He mumbled something about vintage charm, but Zuri cut him off with a look that promised a swift professional death. I didn't argue. I didn't cry then. Tears are a luxury for the defeated, and I was far from defeated. I was merely calculating the cost of her pride. Zuri was a powerhouse, one of the youngest successful architects in the city, hailed for her innovative use of textiles in structural design, a direct inheritance of the genius she so vehemently denied. She had built her empire on the knowledge gleaned from my studio floor. From the evenings spent watching me engineer stress points in ball gowns and counterweights in curtain panels, she knew deep down that the intricate custom-dyed mesh of her latest, multi-million-dollar proposal, the one she was presenting to her future in-laws. This week was a variation on my patented floating weave technique. She snatched the dress from the table, her fingernails catching one of the delicate, tension-bearing threads, a microscopic tear in the composite. She shoved the gown into the nearest garment bag, the aggressive movement crushing months of careful structuring. "The Paris gown arrives tomorrow. Please, Mother, just be a quiet guest." A very quiet guest. The financial vengeance would wait. The emotional price was already being paid in full. I watched her walk away, her back rigid with the burden of maintaining a facade that was beginning to crack under the pressure of its own fabrication. It was a testament to her talent that she could build structures so magnificent, yet fail so spectacularly to secure her own foundation. But she had underestimated one thing. A woman who stitches for a living understands that every flaw, every loose thread can be the precise point where the entire structure gives way. I had engineered that rejection. I had crafted that flaw, and I knew exactly when and how her elaborate, beautiful world would begin to unravel. My eyes fell on the tiny, almost invisible tear in the fabric of my gown. That tear was now a signal, a cue. It was the first necessary breach in the wall of pride Zuri had constructed between us. I walked over to the garbage bin where she kept her discarded samples and pulled out the crumpled garment bag. The silk was wrinkled, yes, but the structural fabric remained resilient. I would spend the coming days not merely mending a dress, but reinforcing the entire framework of my justice. I returned to my machine, but instead of thread, I pulled out a roll of blueprints Zuri had carelessly left on her drafting table. The schematics for the Ellington family's flagship architectural project, the one she was using to secure her partnership, her marriage, and her entire future. I placed the massive sheet beneath my needle. I didn't intend to read the plans. I intended to feel them. The language of architecture is merely the formal transcription of the language of fabric. The load-bearing columns, the suspension cables, the pressure points, they were all recognizable patterns. And in the center of the blueprints, where the stress analysis was most critical, I noticed a familiar weakness. A technical error so subtle, so profoundly dangerous, that only the master artisan of the fabric itself would recognize it. It was the same weakness Zuri had shown in throwing away my love. I smiled, a cold, hard, matriarchal smile. She had given me not only her deepest wound, but the exact specifications of her downfall. I would not mend the dress yet. I would first mend her sense of value. I decided that the wedding wouldn't be a celebration of Zuri's ascension. It would be a public performance of her humility. She had built a career on my expertise, claimed my technical innovations as her own abstract concepts, and scorned the hands that had fed and taught her. The world praises the architect who draws the line, but it forgets the seamstress who makes the line possible. That imbalance was about to be corrected. The first step was to acknowledge the depth of the deception. Zuri wasn't just embarrassed by me. She was afraid of me. She knew that if anyone, especially the ruthlessly traditional Ellingtons, knew her celebrated. Groundbreaking woven facade was directly derived from a poor seamstress's traditional African textile engineering. Her entire reputation would collapse. She presented herself as the intellectual visionary. I was the inconvenient truth, the material reality behind her abstraction. I began my research, spending hours in the dusty archives of the old city library. I found historical records of my grandmother's work. The original diagrams detailing the floating weave, a technique developed generations ago by women in my family to create stable, complex tent structures from lightweight materials. It was pure applied physics disguised as needlework. The elegance of it lay in its invisibility, its ability to hold massive weight while appearing delicate. Zuri had digitized this legacy, packaged it, and sold it to the global corporate market as her innovative approach to sustainable textiles in urban design. The irony was a razor edge. Her $10 million project, the one that guaranteed her partnership in the Ellington firm and her marriage to Ethan, relied on the precise, non-digital hand tensioning of a specific textile weave. Without the master's touch, the system would fail. The complex structural fabric would begin to stretch, sag, and eventually the whole facade would ripple, revealing the cheap, quick, machine-made shortcuts Zuri had authorized to cut costs. Her vision would become a public, visible metaphor for her moral bankruptcy. I picked up the needle again, but this time I wasn't sewing the wedding dress. I was sewing a counter-document. I took a piece of the discarded structural fabric, a sample Zuri herself had thrown away, and began to replicate the flaw she had introduced in the construction of her flagship architectural project. Every stitch was a deliberate act of reverse engineering, an application of ancient wisdom to modern betrayal. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was restoring equilibrium. I was proving a fundamental law of physics. Structure requires integrity. The air in the studio grew heavy with focused resolve. The matriarch's will, I thought, is simply the decision to value truth above all else. Zuri had chosen wealth and status. I would choose dignity and justice. And the wedding, that temple of opulence, would be the most spectacular unveiling of truth the city had ever seen. The clock ticked, not marking the hours until the ceremony, but marking the calculated moment of my strike. Every thread had its purpose, and Zuri's time had run out. Her masterpiece was flawed, and only the hand that sewed the original wisdom could expose the lie. The sheer audacity of her denial, the total erasure of her heritage, fueled my hands. She truly believed that because her version was digitized, projected onto a skyscraper in renderings, and spoken about in jargon-laden boardroom meetings, it transcended the simple reality of the needle and thread. She confused scale with substance. But every architect, every builder knows that the smallest joint carries the weight of the largest vision. I knew the specific weakness in her proposal. It wasn't a flaw in the digital model. It was a flaw in the material integrity, an intrinsic property of the textile itself that Zuri, having only worked with simulations, fundamentally misunderstood. I focused on the tiny composite fiber I held, the sample of the material she was using for the woven facade. This fiber was exceptionally strong, yet under prolonged fluctuating tension like wind shear on a 40-story building. It required the precise counterbalance of a much thinner, more resilient thread. This thread, the guardian line, was my family's signature. It was invisible to the eye but essential to the structure. Zuri had skimped on it, calculating that the cheaper machine-tension primary composite would hold. She was wrong. And her professional life, her marriage, and her inheritance were about to hang on that single, overlooked thread. I pulled out a small mahogany box, my grandmother's original sewing kit. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a spool of the guardian line. It wasn't just thread. It was a composite of finely twisted linen and carbon nanofiber, painstakingly hand-prepared. It was the material that defined my art, the physical representation of the wisdom she rejected. I did not want to destroy Zuri. I wanted to teach her. I wanted her to feel the cold, terrifying weight of consequence that only a true structural failure can deliver. If the flaw remained in her project, the building would not collapse. That was too dramatic, too crude. Worse than that, it would fail publicly, slowly, and visibly right after the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The woven facade would begin to buckle, the smooth, elegant lines warping into an embarrassing, visible ripple of incompetence. My attention turned back to the dress she had discarded. The rejected wedding gown. It was the perfect decoy, the Trojan horse of my retribution. I began to mend the tears Zuri's fingernail had inflicted, but my repair was deliberate, a structural anomaly. I wove in a microscopic piece of the guardian line, but I tensioned it incorrectly, just enough to be invisible, yet enough to create an area of high stress. When Zuri eventually found it, which I was certain she would, given her compulsive need for control, she would believe this was the only secret. She would assume I had merely repaired the damage and left a small, emotional mark. This was the first layer of the deception. The true weapon was not in the dress, but in the truth itself. The dress was merely the theatrical prop to draw attention to the real problem, the architectural fraud. The next days were spent preparing the physical evidence. I created a small, detailed cross-section model of the woven facade's critical joint, using Zuri's own flawed composite. Next to it, I meticulously stitched a second cross-section, incorporating the guardian line. The contrast was stark. One sample was smooth, robust, and held its shape perfectly. The other, Zuri's version, already showed microscopic fraying around the stress point. It was undeniable proof of her material miscalculation, proof that she had traded structural integrity for cost-cutting margins. I needed to deliver this evidence to the one person whose judgment mattered more than Zuri's pride: Ethan's father. Mr. Ellington, the patriarch of the firm and a man known for his cold, unyielding commitment to engineering precision. I knew he would be attending the bridal luncheon at the Grand Magnolia Hotel, a low-key, private affair the day before the wedding. Zuri would be too distracted to notice me. I've planned my own appearance. I wouldn't wear my finest clothes. I would wear this simple, humble dress. I always wore the one Zuri found so embarrassing, but I would wear it with the dignity of a woman who understands true value. On the morning of the luncheon, the air was sharp with the promise of rain. I wrapped my evidence through textile cross-sections and a short, typewritten note detailing the structural flaw in a piece of the discarded wedding gown fabric. I placed the package inside a plain brown envelope, one that looked utterly unremarkable, as I walked through the city. Past the towering glass and steel structures Zuri admired, I felt no fear, only the focused weight of my purpose. I was not sneaking into a party. I was delivering a truth. Zuri had forgotten that the power of a legacy is not in the size of the inheritance, but in the strength of its core principles. Her principle was ambition. Mine was integrity. And integrity, like my needle, always finds its mark. I arrived at the Grand Magnolia, a palace of gilded luxury. I saw Zuri through the window, laughing with Ethan's family. She looked beautiful, flawless, a perfect image of the woman she pretended to be. I took a deep breath, walked past the doorman, and entered the quiet marble lobby. I did not seek Zuri. I sought Mr. Ellington. He was sitting at a small table, reviewing a thick portfolio separate from the bridal party. He looked up, his eyes sharp and assessing. They dismissed me immediately, categorizing me as a lost caterer or a mistaken delivery person. "May I help you?" he asked, his voice low and utterly devoid of warmth. "I have a delivery for you, Mr. Ellington," I said, my voice steady. "It's about the woven facade project." His demeanor shifted instantly. Business was the only language he respected. He extended a hand for the envelope, never once looking at my face, focused solely on the brown paper. I placed the envelope in his hand. My fingers brushed his. "The integrity of your foundation is at stake, sir," I stated, locking my eyes with his. "The information inside cannot be dismissed. It is a technical truth." He finally looked at me, a flicker of suspicion replacing indifference. Before he could question me further, I turned and walked out. My work there was done. The seed of doubt, the first pinprick of truth, had been sown in the one place Zuri could never afford it to land. The wedding was now scheduled to be an audit, not a celebration. The Matriarchs will have begun its reading. The hours between the luncheon and the wedding felt like the slow draw of thread before a final heavy stitch. Zuri, oblivious to the ticking clock, sent me a terse text message confirming my seating arrangement far away from the family table near the service entrance. "Mother, I've secured your place. Please be punctual and subtle." Her use of the word subtle was a final, dismissive flick of the wrist. It was a word meant to confine me, to make me small. I smiled, thinking of the magnificent chaos my subtlety was about to unleash. I spent the rest of the day in my studio. The wedding gown, now reinforced with a false sense of security, hung on a mannequin. It was ready for its eventual role as the emotional detonator. But the true weapon, the evidence package, was already at work in Mr. Ellington's meticulous world. He was, I knew, a man of cold logic. He would have immediately tasked his top engineers to verify the structural flaw I had identified. My note was simple and precise. The woven facade's reliance on machine-tensioned primary composite, without the counter-tensioning of the guardian line, will result in a total structural failure of the facade within 6 months of installation, manifesting first as a visible ripple at the main stress joints. A failure was not a possibility. It was a certainty, a matter of material physics. Zuri, the genius architect, had overlooked the simple human truth that digital models cannot account for the slow, relentless fatigue of real-world materials when subjected to wind and time. The irony was exquisite. Her fraud was not an invented lie. It was a fundamental misreading of the material truth that was my family's legacy. As the sun set, I began to dress. I chose a deep, charcoal gray dress, cut in a severe, simple silhouette that emphasized dignity, not decoration. It was the antithesis of the glittering opulence Zuri demanded. I wore no jewelry, save for a single heavy silver thimble, my grandmother's, that I kept tucked deep into my pocket. It was the only armor I needed. My reflection showed a woman who was calm, focused, and utterly without doubt. I was no longer the heartbroken seamstress. I was the matriarch administering the most important lesson of Zuri's life. Justice is often quiet, cold, and woven from threads of truth. I arrived at the Grand Magnolia Ballroom exactly on time. The space was a blinding spectacle of white roses, crystal, and imported Italian marble. Zuri had achieved the perfection she craved. It was a space designed to intimidate, to elevate the new elite, and to erase the past. I felt the familiar dismissive glances from the gatekeepers, the staff, and the early arriving, impeccably dressed guests. I accepted my assigned seat near the service entrance with practiced grace. I watched the Ellingtons arrive, a fortress of expensive tailoring and inherited confidence. Then I saw Zuri, radiant in the Parisian gown, a stark, modern creation that looked magnificent but utterly devoid of soul. It was a costume flawlessly executed, designed to signal status. It signaled nothing of who she was, or where she came from. The ceremony was a blur of polite affirmations and inherited wealth. I did not focus on the vows. I focused on Mr. Ellington. He sat stiffly at the head table, his attention frequently drifting from the ceremony to a discreet, expensive phone he kept tucked into his hand. His posture was rigid, not with joy, but with the cold, internal calculation of a man facing a major, unexpected financial threat. The seed of doubt had clearly germinated as the reception began and Zuri and Ethan took to the dance floor. The entire ballroom seemed to hum with the energy of status and pretense. Zuri looked triumphant. She believed she had one. She was the architect of her own destiny, standing on a structure of lies and discarded love. My moment was approaching. I felt the weight of my grandmother's thimble in my pocket, reminder that the true work is always done with hands, not with declarations. I needed to move the physical evidence of Zuri's lie from my safe location to the center of the ballroom floor. My plan required a collaborator, someone outside the emotional turmoil, someone who understood the sheer, undeniable authority of material truth. I scanned the room and found my target, Mrs. Kalu, an acclaimed older journalist specializing in architectural ethics, who was known to be a guest of Mr. Ellington. She was seated alone, observing the opulence with a journalist's cool, skeptical eye. I rose slowly from my seat, not towards the head table, but toward the service corridor. I retrieved the discarded garment bag containing my gown. I carried it loosely, deliberately, ensuring the shape was visible, yet the contents obscured. This was the first piece of theater. It signaled to everyone, especially Zuri, who was now dancing, that the shameful dress was present. My heart pounded with a steady, determined rhythm. I approached Mrs. Kalu's table. "Mrs. Kalu," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise with a quiet authority that demanded attention. "I apologize for the intrusion. I am Afia, the bride's mother." She looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and professional curiosity. "Ah, Mrs. Bakari, your daughter is radiant." "She is magnificent," I agreed, a touch of genuine pride in my voice. "But brilliance must be built on honesty. I have something that pertains to the ethics of her woven facade project. It is crucial, technical, and requires your discerning eye." I placed the garment bag next to her chair. She looked confused. "The dress." "No," I replied, my gaze hardening. "The blueprint for her future. The truth about that facade is not in the architecture, but in the material integrity. Zuri needs to be held accountable not for being ambitious, but for sacrificing truth for speed. I ask you to keep this bag near you." At the moment I unveil the dress, open the bag fully, you will find something inside that speaks far louder than the silk. I did not wait for her answer. I did not give her time to refuse. I had given her a story, the one thing a journalist cannot refuse. I turned and walked toward the center of the ballroom, carrying the heavy truth of my sacrifice, ready to perform the final act of the matriarch's will. The silence I had endured for years was about to break into a roar. The music swelled, wrapping Zuri and Ethan in a cocoon of false security. I walked slowly, deliberately, tracing a path through the crowded floor that guaranteed every eye would track my movement. The matriarch's presence was a statement, a challenge to the room's established hierarchy. My charcoal dress against the sea of sparkling gowns was a sharp, focused point of critique. As I neared the edge of the dance floor, Zuri finally saw me. Her eyes widened, a flicker of panic overtaking the carefully cultivated facade of joy. She stopped dancing mid-turn, the momentum leaving Ethan slightly confused. She gestured sharply with her hand, an imperative that meant, "Stop. Turn back. Stay in your cage." I ignored her. I took one final step onto the edge of the polished mahogany floor. The light caught the silver thimble in my pocket. A quiet metallic gleam, my family crest. I stood there for a long, agonizing moment. I did not speak. I did not move. I allowed the murmurs of the room to rise and fall. The curiosity of the guests, a rising tide that would soon crash over Zuri's perfectly constructed world. Then I turned my attention to the head table, catching Mr. Ellington's eye. His look was no longer dismissive. It was calculating, anxious, the look of a man who had received confirmation of a disaster. He knew. My evidence had been verified. Zuri rushed toward me, her designer gown swirling around her like a cage. "Mother, what are you doing? Go back to your seat, now," she hissed, the corporate ice finally cracking to reveal pure fear. "You are embarrassing me." I finally spoke, my voice low, clear, and perfectly amplified by the sudden hush of the room. "Embarrassment is the price of forgetting. Zuri, I am here to remind you of the foundation upon which your magnificent life is built." I reached into my pocket and, with deliberate slowness, pulled out the simple, tarnished silver thimble. I held it up, allowing the spotlight to catch its ancient gleam. "This," I announced, my voice carrying the authority of generations, "is the tool of a seamstress. You built a career on the belief that a seamstress merely follows instructions. But I, Zuri, am the one who sewed the blueprints." Zuri's face went white. She knew the phrase. It was an old family saying, a boast of my grandmother's. It meant that my family's textile engineering was the source code for her architectural genius. "The woven facade is a spectacular design," I continued, addressing the room, speaking to the Ellingtons and the media guests, never breaking eye contact with Zuri's horrified gaze. "A triumph of modern, sustainable architecture. But Zuri, my daughter, committed an intellectual and material fraud. She stole a legacy she refused to honor." The tension in the ballroom was a physical force. Guests gasped. Mrs. Kalu, the journalist, was already signaling her assistant. "You dismissed my contribution," I stated, my voice losing all emotion, becoming a pure conduit for fact. "You rejected my love because it came with the smell of work, of humility. You replaced structural truth with cheap expediency to save pennies on a multi-million-dollar project." I paused, allowing the sheer weight of the implied financial scandal to land. "The dress you discarded," I finished, pointing an unwavering finger towards the garment bag now resting next to Mrs. Kalu, "is merely the theatrical cue. The real proof is in the fabric of the lie." I turned to Mrs. Kalu and gave a single sharp nod. The journalist understood the unspoken command. Her assistant, ready for the scoop, immediately pulled the brown envelope from the garment bag. "The woven facade is compromised," I thought. And now everyone knows the truth behind the architect's pride. The crowd noise, which had been a low, agitated hum, now shattered into a cacophony of fear and speculation. It was the sound of money panicking. The assistant, a nervous young woman with sharp eyes, unfolded the contents of the brown envelope with trembling hands. Zuri watched, petrified, her perfect Parisian gown suddenly seeming like a flimsy paper doll. She had underestimated the power of the material truth I had delivered. She thought my presence was a social hazard. She was learning that I was a structural one. Inside the envelope were not damning words or personal letters, but two small, meticulously framed cross-sections of textile composite, labeled A and B next to them. Resting on a field of white was a single, clean sheet of paper containing only 3 paragraphs of clinical, brutal engineering analysis. The silence that fell over the head table was immediate, heavy and absolute, confirming that Mr. Ellington, the patriarch of the empire Zuri sought to join, was already intimately familiar with the terrifying implications of those samples. I had used a piece of fabric worth perhaps $500, if sold to a discerning artisan, to expose a $10 million fraud. The elegance of my vengeance lay in that exact asymmetry. Zuri built her career on the concept of the woven facade, I stated, turning slowly to face the guests, allowing my voice to penetrate the rising anxiety. A celebrated system using composite textiles to create breathable, self-tensioning exteriors for skyscrapers. A concept she presented as her own innovation. I let a beat of cold silence hang in the air. I did not attend Harvard. I did not study engineering at MIT, but I am the one who engineered the original weave. The principle is ancient. It is the guardian line. My eyes met Mrs. Kalu's, The journalist, recognizing a monumental story breaking in front of her, was now fully focused. She picked up the white paper, her fingers gliding over the analysis I had written. She didn't need to read the full technical details. The conclusion was the headline: the composite Zuri used in the final build of the Ellington Tower. I continued, my voice gaining volume, is inferior. It lacks the counter-tensioning of the Guardian line, the crucial thread that prevents material fatigue and visible rippling under constant shear stress. She cut corners. She substituted my family's inherited, hand-prepared composite for a cheap machine-made analog to increase her profit margin and impress her board. I pointed to the samples held by the assistant. Sample A is the inferior, Zuri-approved fabric. Notice the microscopic fraying, the slight sag already present. That slight sag on a 40-story tower will become a grotesque, visible ripple within 6 months. The woven facade will look like crumpled sheet metal, a testament to intellectual theft and professional incompetence. The collective gasp from the guests was satisfying. They understood the language of visibility. Architectural failure is a quiet, gradual form of public humiliation that destroys reputation more thoroughly than any dramatic collapse. Zuri's design would not only be a costly repair, it would be a visible stain on the Ellington name. Zuri finally moved, shattering her frozen silence. She took 2 steps towards me, her face contorted in a mask of pure, white-hot fury. You cannot do this, Mother. This is lies, slander. I'll sue you out of existence. I will ruin you. Ruin me? I asked, meeting her fury with tranquil wisdom. You threw away the gown I spent 7 months weaving. Gown that contained the very Guardian line she needed to save her career. You threw away the $500 fabric that held the truth, Zuri, because you were ashamed of the hands that created it. That, my daughter, is a $1 million lie. I glanced back at Mr. Ellington. He was no longer looking at the samples. He was looking at Zuri. The evidence was confirmed. The professional betrayal was a done deal. The only variable now was the motive. And the motive was personal. The sheer audacity of my confrontation left the room paralyzed. The guests, who moments ago were discussing stock portfolios and summer estates, were now watching a masterclass in familial and corporate sabotage. I understood their confusion. They expected a loud, tearful mother, not a calm forensic analyst of structural failure. That unexpected authority was my true weapon. Zuri's panic was escalating, morphing from anger into desperation. She was trapped between the architect she pretended to be and the daughter she refused to acknowledge. She knew that in the world of high-stakes contracts and inherited legacy, material integrity was non-negotiable. The flaw I had identified wasn't a matter of taste. It was a matter of solvency. You have no idea what you're talking about. Guys. Zuri stammered, frantically scanning the room for an ally, finding none. Ethan, her fiancé, looked utterly lost, staring at his father. Mr. Ellington, whose face had hardened into an impenetrable granite mask. This is insane. She's a seamstress. She's mentally unwell. She knows nothing of structural textiles. Get her out of here. I shook my head, a slow, deliberate motion that conveyed disappointment rather than malice. I know everything, Zuri, because I am the source. You learn the geometric tensions and weave principles while sitting on my studio floor, playing with scraps of the Guardian line. You saw the mathematical genius in the knotwork, and you converted it into a digital abstract. But you forgot the most critical rule taught in our family for 3 generations. A true structural weave must be given its soul by the hand, not by the machine. I allowed my gaze to sweep across the opulent room, engaging the entire audience in the lecture on truth and craftsmanship. The Guardian line is not merely a thread. It is a proprietary composite requiring precise, subtle hand tensioning to achieve its counterlasticity. The machines you used, Zuri, treat all tension as uniform. They do not account for the material's innate fatigue points. Your $10 million facade is a mechanical imitation of a spiritual truth, and it will fail. Mrs. Kalu seized the opportunity, her professional instinct taking over. She held up the sample of the flawed fabric and addressed the room. The documents confirm that the bride's mother submitted a peer-reviewed technical analysis earlier today to Mr. Ellington. The implications are staggering. A deliberate, undisclosed materials substitution jeopardizing a major contract and the Ellington name. The journalistic narrative was now set, not a family feud, but a scandal of corporate integrity. Mr. Ellington finally spoke, his voice heavy, cutting through the murmurs like a steel wire. He spoke not to Zuri but to the entire room, establishing immediate damage control. The firm will issue a statement immediately. We are aware of recent structural concerns regarding the textile matrix. We have already initiated a full internal audit. Okay. He was admitting the truth, but trying to seize control of the narrative. Then his attention snapped back to Zuri, and his voice dropped to a terrifying whisper audible only to those closest to the head table, but devastating in its intensity. You jeopardize 40 years of this family's reputation for a cheap margin, Zuri, and you bring your own mother into a social setting to expose it? You lack integrity in business and in blood. Zuri crumbled. Her shoulders slumped, and the polished veneer of the successful architect cracked entirely. The million-dollar lie was exposed, not by a lawyer, but by the tangible evidence of a few $100s worth of flawed fabric. Her professional ruin was now an irrevocable reality. My work, however, was not finished. The objective was not merely to destroy her reputation, but to ensure that the lesson was learned and the legacy was restored. I needed to reveal the depth of her denial and the sheer waste of her actions. Zuri said, stepping closer to her, forcing her to look into my eyes. When you discarded that wedding dress, you discarded the solution. I built that gown using the correct guardian line weave. It was a gift of both love and professional integrity. You had the fix in your hand, but your pride told you it was trash. I reached down to the floor, where the garment bag containing the original wedding dress was still resting. Next to Mrs. Kalu, I didn't pull out the dress. I reached inside and withdrew a small, intricately woven piece of cloth, piece I had attached to the lining. It was a square of the genuine hand-tension guardian line. This small piece, I stated, holding it up, cost virtually nothing, yet holds all the material truth you needed. It holds the key to the flaw you introduced. You cannot cheat the weave, Zuri. You cannot cheat the truth. It's the sight of the small, hand-woven square seemed to drain the last vestige of strength from Zuri. That fabric was not just a symbol of the correct weave. It was a tangible relic of her childhood, when she had watched me prepare the material, mesmerized by the complex patterns. The look on her face was no longer fury or shame. It was a devastating realization of irreversible loss. She had thrown away the most valuable asset of her professional life, the proprietary knowledge residing in her own family, because she believed humility was weakness. The room remained absolutely silent, captivated by the slow-motion collapse of the bride's perfect life. Mr. Ellington motioned discreetly to his security detail. But his intent was not to remove me. It was to seal off the head table, ensuring no further information escaped until he could control the fallout. I had their full, terrified attention. I spoke directly to Zuri, making this a final, painful accounting between us. You believed your value was in the luxury of the Parisian label, okay? In the abstract concepts of architecture, in the height of the building. You severed the connection to the honest, applied art that gave you everything. Do you remember what you told me, Zuri, as you discarded the gown? Her lips trembled. She couldn't speak, but her eyes, wide and filling with tears, answered, "You called it a dress for a poor person." I supplied, the words sharp but necessary. You valued status over structure. But in the world of high finance and architecture, Zuri, a flaw in the structure, the moment it is visible, means financial ruin. The poor person's fabric, the fabric you dismissed, was the only thing that could save your million-dollar career. Your lie cost you everything. I placed the small square of the guardian line on the closest table, next to a crystal vase. It looked utterly insignificant next to the ballroom's extravagance. Yet its presence was the most powerful force in the room. It was the physical manifestation of the matriarch's will. The truth always asserts itself, no matter how humble its form, Mrs. Kalu. Recognizing the perfect, dramatic conclusion to the scene, was already tapping furiously on her phone, ready to break the story before Mr. Ellington's press release could spin it. The headline would write itself. Architect bride exposed by seamstress mother on wedding day, Ethan. Zuri's fiancé finally found his voice, turning his confusion into a desperate plea towards his father. Dad, please. It can be fixed. We can fix it. Zuri and I? Mr. Ellington cut him off with a chilling finality. There is no we, Ethan. There is only integrity. And Ms. Bakari has proven that Zuri possesses none, neither in business nor in judgment. The engagement is terminated, effective immediately. The pronouncement was delivered without anger. It's the cold calculation of a financial transaction being abruptly canceled. Zuri collapsed entirely. She fell to her knees on the polished floor, her elaborate white gown pooling around her like the tide of her ruin. She cried not for the lost marriage or the lost project, but for the profound, terrifying realization that her mother, the person she was most ashamed of, the only person who truly understood the rules of the game she was trying to play. I did not move toward her. I had delivered the lesson. The learning must be her own. My purpose was achieved. The dignity of the seamstress, the value of the artisan, and the supremacy of material truth had been restored in the most public forum possible. The matriarch's will had been read. I stood motionless, watching Zuri weep into the expensive marble floor. The sound was not the soft lament of a heartbroken bride. It was the raw, guttural cry of a career incinerated, a future dissolved into the acid of her own pride. I felt no triumph, only the cold, stark realization that the lesson had been delivered at the highest possible cost. This moment was the bitter fruit of an ultimatum she had given me years ago, a wound that never truly healed, and the necessary foundation for the ultimatum I was about to deliver. The ballroom, once a vessel of celebration, had become a chamber of commerce tragedy. Mrs. Kalu was already being swarmed by other journalists, and Mr. Ellington was barking low, severe orders into his phone, his face a perfect mask of corporate damage control. The crowd was a swirling eddy of morbid curiosity and polite retreat. Nobody moves toward catastrophe unless they have a camera or a contract. I turned away from the spectacle, leaving Zuri to the wreckage she had engineered. My own ultimatum, the one that had poisoned the preceding 5 years of our lives, flashed vividly in my mind. The moment Zuri had officially codified her shame, it wasn't a shouting match. It was a conversation conducted over cold, sterile marble in the lobby of her first major architectural firm. She had just landed a competitive fellowship, the first step towards her multi-million-dollar ambition. I had come beaming, carrying a new portfolio case I had custom sewn from genuine leather, a small, humble gift to mark her achievement. She took the case, her slender fingers barely brushing mine, and placed it immediately behind the concierge desk as if it were contaminated waste. Then she delivered the cold, hard contract of her new life. I am building a new professional narrative, Mother, she had explained, her eyes fixed not on me, but on some point far beyond my shoulder. I am Zuri Bakari, the visionary. They see me as an immigrant success story, a self-made woman who overcame economic disadvantage. They don't need to see the disadvantage every Friday night. I waited, the smile freezing on my face, the pride turning to a sharp, sudden ache. This means, she continued, articulating each syllable with devastating clarity, that you cannot visit my office. You cannot come to company events. And when we are in public, particularly when the Ellingtons are present hand, they will be present often. You must not introduce yourself as my seamstress, or even as my mother. If anyone asks, you are simply a family friend, Afia, nothing more. She looked directly at me then, her gaze cold and firm like a steel girder. Don't tell anyone you know me. Not who you really are. Not the hands that paid for my education. It cheapens the narrative. The leather portfolio, the one I had stitched for days, suddenly felt heavy with the weight of that dismissal. It was the moment she traded truth for aspiration, dignity for status. She didn't just want to rise above me. She wanted to erase the very origin story that gave her genius its structural integrity. I remember nodding, the only outward sign of my compliance. I took the emotional blow, tucked it deep inside, and began preparing for the day the truth would demand its reckoning. That day was now. The public scene I had just orchestrated was the devastating counter-ultimatum. She had asked me to become small and invisible. I had chosen to become large and undeniable. The silence of my compliance years ago had bought me the access to the information, the architectural drafts, the material samples, the social context I needed to execute this lesson with surgical precision. I watched as Mrs. Kalu, sensing that the main emotional display was over, moved toward Zuri. The journalist was not offering comfort. She was moving in for the interview. The final confirmation of the corporate collapse, Ms. Bakari. The journalist's voice was professional, yet edged with metallic fascination. Can you comment on Mr. Ellington's decision and your mother's technical claims? Do you accept that the structural fabric is compromised? Zuri lifted her head from the floor, her makeup smeared, her posture broken. She looked straight at Mrs. Kalu, and then her gaze found mine. It was a look of pure, concentrated hatred, but beneath the hatred, I saw a flicker of profound, desolate realization. She saw the full cost of her ultimatum. She had sacrificed her moral integrity for a lie, and now the universe was collecting its debt. I knew that this moment, the public, unscripted confession was the final structural piece needed to anchor the story of her downfall. I would give her one final opportunity to choose the truth. I stepped closer, deliberately inserting myself into the interview, placing my dignity directly opposite her ruin. The raw hatred in Zuri's eyes was a mirror reflecting the depth of her shame. It was a venomous response to the fact that I had not only disregarded her strict demands for subtlety, but had chosen the moment of her highest, professional ascent, to force her public descent. The matriarch's will does not administer justice with a soft touch. It uses the sharp, unforgiving precision of the needle. Zuri, I said softly, my voice cutting through the journalist's questioning. You commanded me to deny our bond, to dismiss the hands that worked for your future. Do you understand now that the only thing that cheapened your success was the shame you felt for its origin? She tried to regain control, struggling to stand, leaning heavily on the nearest table, her breath ragged. She attempted to reassert the narrative, clutching at the remnants of her professional persona. This is a malicious smear, a family argument twisted for attention. The woven facade is structurally sound. My mother is merely jealous of my success. The familiar lie hung stale in the air, a final, desperate gasp of pride. But it fell flat. Mr. Ellington's silence, and the presence of his concerned engineers now huddled nearby, spoke louder than any denial. Jealousy is the emotion of the unskilled. Zuri, I countered, my authority unwavering. I am the artisan who created the original formula. The principles you used to draft your skyscraper were taught to you on my knee. There is no jealousy, only the cold analysis of a structural failure. You chose the cheap substitute, the machine-tensioned fabric, because it was easier than honoring the hand-sewn integrity of our legacy. I spoke to the audience again, shifting the narrative from personal feud to a public indictment of corporate shortcuts. The price of this lie is not just a marriage contract, but the reputation of the entire Ellington empire. When the facade ripples, when the structural fatigue becomes visible for all of Charlotte to see, the world will ask, who cut the corners? The answer is not in the digital blueprint. The answer is in the flawed machine-made thread. I saw the conflict raging behind Zuri's eyes, the urge to scream, to lash out, fighting with the realization that the only way out of this immediate, catastrophic mess was through the truth, through my hands. She stumbled towards me, not with hostility, but with a horrifying, broken appeal. The contract. My project. It will be terminated. I will be ruined. Everything I worked for, She couldn't finish the sentence. Everything you worked for was built on the lie you commanded me to live. Stated simply, you asked me to disappear so your success could seem abstract, unattached to the humility of my labor. I refused. I taught you that structure requires a firm foundation. You forgot that the foundation of a life is dignity. I had established the full weight of the matriarch's critique. Now it was time to transition to the opportunity for redemption. The next step in the matriarch's will. The lesson had been taught through destruction. The next phase would be built through construction. I reached out and placed my hand gently but firmly on her shoulder. The touch was not one of comfort, but of absolute, unyielding control. You gave me an ultimatum, Zuri. Now I give you mine. I am the only person in this room who understands the guardian line well enough to stabilize your flawed structure. I am the only one who can save your career from total visible ruin. Zuri flinched under my touch, the gravity of the bargain sinking in. She knew I spoke the truth. Her academic knowledge was useless against the technical specificity of the material failure, but the cost of my assistance. I continued, my voice low and dangerous, will be the complete and absolute dismantling of the lie you built. The next section of this story, Zuri, is about humility. You asked me to deny you. Now you must publicly embrace me. You must honor the hands and the legacy you scorned. Mr. Ellington, having observed the exchange, now stepped forward, his eyes narrowed, calculating the financial viability of my offer. He didn't care about the mother-daughter drama. He only cared about the $10 million failure. Now resting on his firm's reputation, Mr. Ellington ignored Zuri completely, addressing me as a professional colleague, a structural expert whose analysis held lethal weight. Mrs. Bakari, he clipped, his voice sharp with urgency. Let's dispense with the theater. If your claim regarding the counter-tensioning thread is accurate, and my initial audit suggests it may be, then time is our enemy. What is your proposal? How do you fix a facade of that scale without demolishing the project entirely? I maintained eye contact, never lowering my gaze to acknowledge his status. He was a businessman negotiating with the matriarch. The solution is not in demolition, Mr. Ellington. It is in restoration. The guardian line requires a layer of secondary tensioning, meticulously and manually woven into the existing composite to prevent the material fatigue from becoming a catastrophic visible ripple. It is intricate, dangerous work, and it requires the hands of an artisan who understands the soul of the material, not just the abstract math. Story stood nearby, breathing heavily, listening to the conversation that was deciding the fate of her future. She was a silent spectator at the auction of her own pride. And the cost? Ellington demanded. The financial cost is negotiable. Mr. Ellington, I stated, injecting the financial vengeance theme precisely. The price for saving your firm's reputation and Zuri's career is the restoration of my dignity. The initial payment must be a complete public acknowledgement that the woven facade concept originated with the applied textile engineering of Afia Bakari and her family's legacy. Not a footnote, sir. A headline. Ellington paused, the demand for humility freezing him. He valued control and reputation above all. This acknowledgement was a profound surrender of narrative. And the second condition, I added, my voice hardening, looking directly at Zuri. The daughter who gave me the ultimatum to deny our blood must now agree to work with me. She will not lead. She will not supervise. She will become my apprentice in the restoration of the facade. She will learn to honor the material truth that she scorned. She will learn to sew the blueprint herself. The crowd watched Zuri. Her future, the penthouse, the magazine covers, the prestige was gone. Her only path forward was through the small, simple door of humility that she had sealed shut years ago. She finally looked at me, a profound mixture of defeat and dawning understanding washing over her face. The truth, in the form of $1 million corporate failure, had finally shattered her pride. Mr. Ellington, the formidable patriarch, stood suspended between two unbearable realities: financial catastrophe and public humiliation. My demand was simple, yet strategically designed to address both. He had to publicly honor the seamstress to save the architect's project. The air around Zuri was thick with the scent of ozone and shattered dreams. She was breathing in the cold truth that her future now depended entirely on the hands she had spent a decade trying to wash off. I waited. The matriarch never rushes a crucial negotiation. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, forcing Mr. Ellington to calculate the precise value of my conditions. He finally conceded, the word dragged out of him like a heavy anchor. Agreed, Mrs. Bakari. We will issue the necessary press release acknowledging your family's proprietary textile. Engineering. The woven facade's successful restoration will be credited to your expertise. He focused on Zuri, the betrayal clear in his eyes. And you, Zuri, will comply with your mother's demand. You will work under her supervision until the flaw is fully remediated. Zuri's acceptance was a single, painful, barely perceptible nod. She had lost the right to speak. Her voice had been confiscated by her pride. The wedding reception, which had been frozen mid-gasp, now began its slow, awkward dispersion. The guests, having witnessed the most spectacular contract negotiation of the season, realized the show was over. Only the security detail, Mrs. Kalu, and Mr. Ellington's legal team remained. The marble ballroom now transformed into an emergency command center. My work had just begun. The emotional lesson was taught, but the structural repair was a massive, terrifying undertaking. I was tasked with stabilizing a 40-story skyscraper facade, a task that required not only my family's wisdom, but a level of precision that bordered on the impossible. I turned to Zuri, my voice softening just slightly enough to indicate a shift from judge to instructor. You called my work simple, Zuri. You called it cheap. Now you will learn the difference between abstract theory and applied material truth. I led this small group, including a now subdued Zuri, to the project site office downtown. The offices were immaculate, lined with glowing renderings and framed architectural award saw monuments to Zuri's theoretical brilliance. I ignored them all, heading straight for the massive, full-scale sample of the woven facade section that dominated the center of the room. It looked magnificent. The textile composite was smooth, taut, and appeared robust. Zuri pointed to it, a desperate, final attempt at defense. Look, Mother, it's holding. It passed all stress tests. Your claims are exaggerated. I approached the fabric not with a measuring tape or a laser scanner, but with my bare hands. I ran my fingers slowly across the composite, feeling for the minute invisible signals of distress. My hands, calloused and wise, were the only true sensors in the room. The machine tells lies, Zuri, I explained, my voice low. It measures static force. It cannot predict material entropy, thus slow. Inevitable surrender of the fiber over time, accelerated by fluctuating temperature and wind shear. The flaw is not a gap. It is a fatigue point. I pulled out the tiny square of the genuine Guardian line I had shown at the wedding. I held it against the massive composite. This is the language of structural longevity. Your machine-tensioned fabric, what you called the woven facade, is structurally compromised in every square foot where the primary composite meets the aluminum subframe. Zuri finally saw it, not through pride, but through fear. She walked towards the sample, her architect's eye now focused by impending failure. She pointed to a section where the machine weave looked perfectly uniform. Where I don't see it. The tension readings were nominal. The flaw is in the weave, not the tension, I corrected her. The primary composite is strong, but it is brittle without the complementary elasticity of the Guardian line to absorb the sustained low-frequency pressure. Over 6 months, the machine-made composite will tear itself apart from the anchor points. The structural integrity of the entire facade will ripple and fail, not suddenly but with embarrassing public visibility. I delivered the ultimate technical truth, the one she had suppressed during her academic ascent. The solution was equally brutal in its simplicity. We cannot replace the composite, I stated. The financial and logistical cost would be catastrophic. The only solution is to apply a secondary, stabilizing matrix to the entire 40 stories. We must manually and painstakingly weave the guardian line into every single stress point, reinforcing the composite from the inside out. Zuri stared at me, her mind calculating the sheer scale of the labor. The facade consisted of thousands of interlocking panels, each one requiring microscopic, hand-applied reinforcement. The monumental scale of the task hung in the air, transforming this sleek, modern office into a vast, intimidating workshop. Mr. Ellington's legal team exchanged anxious glances, understanding that manually and painstakingly translated directly into time, risk, and astronomical labor costs. I let the realization settle. Zuri's shortcut had become the longest, most arduous path imaginable. The labor is impossible, Zuri finally whispered, her voice husky with defeat. It's thousands of square meters. We can't hire enough people who know that we've mother. Nobody else knows the precise counter-tensioning of the guardian line. Precisely, I affirmed, the determination in my voice absolute, which is why the matriarchs will demand the architect become the apprentice. You will learn the flaw from the inside. 3. You will learn the material honesty that you tried to abstract out of existence. I pulled a spool of the genuine, dark red guardian line from my pocket, the same thread that had been in my grandmother's kit. It looked absurdly simple, yet it held the structural secret of the entire building. The guardian line is not just thread, Zuri. It is a carbon linen composite, hand-twisted to achieve a non-linear elasticity. The critical flaw is that the machine-tensioned anchors on the primary composite read the stress as linear. The guardian line provides the necessary non-linear resistance to distribute the force evenly. Without it, the brittle composite is fighting itself. I knelt down beside the sample and, using only my thimble and a fine, specialized needle, began the repair. The movement was practiced, elegant, and decades old. I demonstrated the specific knot the matriarch's hitch that achieved the perfect counter-tension. It was invisible to the eye once completed, yet absolutely essential to the structural integrity. This single knot, I explained, demonstrating the complex three-dimensional maneuver, is the key to correcting the flaw. It must be applied to every single anchor point. Every knot must be perfect. If the tension is too high, it snaps the anchor. If it's too loose, the ripple begins immediately. There is no room for error. The penalty for a flaw in the matriarch's hitch is a $10 million failure. Zuri watched, her analytical mind absorbing the practical genius of the work, her hands instinctively twitching with the desire to try. She saw the complex mathematics she had studied reduced to the elegant choreography of my fingers. She finally understood the true value of the hands she had scorned. Mr. Ellington, however, was focused on the bottom line. Mrs. Bakari, you speak of necessity, but how do you propose to teach this intricate manual work to a team large enough to complete the facade within the next 6 months before the winter winds begin the irreparable damage? I rose, brushing the imaginary dust from my charcoal dress. The matriarchs will never propose as a solution without a strategy. Mr. Ellington, we will not use a team of external contractors. We will use the women Zuri rejected, the women of the Seamstresses Guild. The women who understand the language of integrity, who understand the absolute truth of material structure. This was the final piece of the matriarch's plan, empowerment and financial vengeance, beautifully interwoven. Zuri's shame would finance the elevation of the very community she had abandoned. The proposal that the elite architectural firm would rely entirely on the manual labor of a seamstress's guild hung in the air, a revolutionary concept that challenged every corporate sensibility. Mr. Ellington looked aghast, his face a roadmap of calculated disbelief. Yet the terror of structural failure outweighed his prejudice. A guild. He repeated the word sounding like foreign currency in his mouth. You propose entrusting a multi-million-dollar structural repair to uncertified, non-unionized seamstresses. I propose entrusting it to the master artisans who possess the specific, proprietary knowledge that your multi-million-dollar firm discarded. I corrected him, my voice carrying the weight of professional authority. The women of the guild, the women I trained, understand the matriarch's hitch. They understand material respect. Your engineers understand abstract force. My women understand applied force. They are the only ones who can perform the stabilization work with the precision and integrity required. Their collective hands are the only certified solution. Zuri stepped forward, a look of grim acceptance on her face. Her voice was low but steady. They can do it, Father. The precision required is artisanal, not mechanical. And they will work faster and with lower error rates than any machine crew. Her professional mind, finally free of the pride that had blinded it, had conceded the undeniable technical truth. The financial terms are non-negotiable. Mr. Ellington, I pressed on. The guild will be paid a premium, a rate commensurate with the specialized life-saving structural work they are performing. The contract will include health benefits, insurance, and a dedicated training facility, a true studio where this knowledge can be passed to the next generation. Was the true financial vengeance, turning Zuri's failure into the structural and economic empowerment of the community she had disdained. I was leveraging her humiliation to build a sustainable legacy of artisanal dignity. Mr. Ellington had nowhere left to turn. He had the confirmed structural flaw, the public exposure, and the only possible remedy standing before him, draped in a simple charcoal dress. He nodded, his surrender complete. Draw up the contract, Mrs. Bakari, immediately. My attention snapped back to Zuri. Her journey had to begin immediately, and it began with the smallest, most humbling of tasks. Your education starts now, Zuri, I commanded. The matriarchs will demand absolute humility. You will not attend board meetings. You will not touch a drafting table. Your role for the next 6 months is to prepare the guardian line. You will be in my studio, using the same tools your great-grandmother used, hand-twisting the carbon line and composite to the precise nonlinear elasticity we require. Zuri's face, still pale from the shock of the wedding collapse, showed a flicker of resistance. But it was quickly extinguished by the absolute finality of my command. She nodded again, the simple, humbling gesture marking the true beginning of her apprenticeship. I reached into the leather bag I carried, not the fancy one she had discarded, but my worn, decades-old satchel, and withdrew a small, primitive wooden tool. It was a spinning frame, simple and functional, covered in the patina of generational use. This is the Threadmaster, I explained, placing it firmly in Zuri's hands. It is the only instrument capable of achieving the necessary nonlinear elasticity in the composite. You will work with this, Zuri, under my supervision, until your hands remember the language of integrity you taught your mind to forget. The cold, unforgiving surface of the ancient wood felt alien and heavy in her hands. She, the celebrated architect of glass and steel, was reduced to mastering a tool that belonged to the 19th century. The irony was exquisite and entirely intentional. Her journey back to honesty would be a tangible, physical one. The critical flaw would be mended, not with abstract mathematics, but with the painful, precise labor of the seamstress. And Zuri, the architect who scorned the hands that sewed her future, would be forced to use those hands to save herself. The Grand Magnolia Ballroom, the scene of Zuri's ruin, was now simply the starting line of her atonement. My focus, however, was already 2 weeks into the future, fixed on the annual Ellington Charity Gala, a shimmering, gold-plated event where Mr. Ellington would introduce the newly restructured woven facade project. It was a mandatory performance of confidence, designed to staunch the hemorrhage of bad press that followed the wedding debacle. He would spin the failure as a proactive quality assurance initiative, but I knew the truth. The gala would serve as a crucial stage for the next phase of the matriarchs will dot my ultimate goal was not just to fix the building, but to fix Zuri's soul, and that required sustained public visibility of her humility. She needed to see the world she craved, but now from the vantage point of the artisan. The worker, the one who held the true power in her hands. For 2 weeks, Zuri became a ghost in her own life. She traded the sleek, sterile environment of the corporate headquarters for the familiar, humid warmth of my studio. Her hands used only to commanding a stylus across a digital screen were raw, blistered, and aching from the continuous, exacting labor of twisting the Guardian Line composite. The work was meditative, repetitive, and brutally honest, a physical mirror of the integrity she lacked. She learned quickly. Her inherent analytical genius finally married to the practical truth of the material. She no longer spoke of abstract tensile stress. She spoke of the scream of the fibers when twisted too tightly. She stopped calling me mother and started calling me a fia. A subtle but profound acknowledgement of my professional authority. One afternoon, as she worked, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. She asked the question that had been hanging between us since the wedding. Why the gala, Afia? The project is secure. The contracts are being re-signed. Why do I have to go to that event? Why do I have to be there? Because the world needs to witness the full visible correction of your mistake. Zuri, I replied, my eyes fixed on the precise knot I was demonstrating. You wanted the spotlight for your triumph. You will now accept the spotlight for your truth. The world knows the architect failed. They need to see the architect repenting. The Ellington Gala was a carnival of wealth, a gathering of the very investors' rivals and socialites who had whispered about the wedding scandal. It was where perception solidified into reality. And Mr. Ellington needed a magnificent display of his renewed trust in the project. And Zuri, the disgraced architect, was required to play her part. But I, the matriarch, had a different plan for the evening. I would not be at the main ballroom. I would be the invisible judge, conducting a critical structural inspection that would either validate our emergency repairs or expose the terrifying flaw anew. The evening before the gala, Zuri's anxiety was a visible aura. She sat at my studio table, twisting the Guardian Line, her eyes red from fatigue and anticipation. They will look at me. They will pity me, Afia. I'm supposed to be the success story. Now I'm the warning. Pity is irrelevant, Zuri, I stated, pushing a small spool of the Guardian Line towards her. Focus on the fiber. Focus on the truth. If you honor the material will honor you. The judgment you should fear is not theirs, but mine. I knew that the ballroom where the gala was held, the city's oldest, most prestigious landmark, had recently undergone a controversial renovation. A specific architectural detail, a massive suspended textile chandelier, had been lauded for its ambitious scale. I had read the blueprints in the city archives years ago. It was a stunning piece of theoretical design, but structurally unsound in its installation. It relied on machine-tensioned cables, lacking the necessary hand-tensioned flexibility to withstand the subtle vibrations of thousands of dancing guests. The textile chandelier in the old landmark ballroom was Zuri's target. Not for exposure, but for education. It was a breathtaking piece of art, a sprawling canopy of light-diffusing fabric. But it was a monument to the very same theoretical hubris that had nearly ruined her. Its structural failure was not a possibility. It was an impending certainty, scheduled to occur during the peak energy of the evening. It was a flaw that only a woman who spoke the language of the Guardian Line could recognize and, more importantly, feel. I presented Zuri with the task, framing it not as a rescue mission but as a field test of her newly acquired wisdom. The gala is tonight, Zuri. You will wear a dress, but not one you choose. You will wear a tool. You will use your presence there. Not for shame, but for the matriarch's purpose. I led her to the mannequin holding the rejected wedding gown. The dress she had, called poor, had been carefully restored and now shimmered with an inner brilliance. Its structural composite perfected by my hands. It was the physical manifestation of her redemption, but it was not the dress she would wear. I pulled out a small, exquisite fitted jacket I had created 2 years ago, using a simple, dark silk. It was plain, save for a delicate, almost invisible pattern woven into the sleeve. This pattern was not decorative. It was a sensory device. I had woven into the liner several strands of the Guardian line, connected to microscopic tension sensors that vibrated subtly in response to nearby atmospheric and structural disturbances. "You will wear this, Zuri," I instructed, handing her the jacket. "The gala is a structural lie. That chandelier is the perfect example of abstract design overwhelming material reality. The sensors woven into this sleeve will not predict a collapse. They will only register the imbalance in the ambient tension of the space. It is a tool for reading the room's structural heart." Zuri examined the sleeve, her architect's curiosity finally overriding her social terror. "It reads instability. It reads dishonesty," I corrected her. "The chandelier, under the dynamic load of 1,000 people dancing, will begin to betray its flawed installation. When the imbalance reaches a critical threshold, the vibration in the sleeve will become noticeable. That is your cue. Your job is not to expose the flaw, Zuri. Your job is to prove you can see the truth before it is visible." This was the final test of her humility and her learning. The matriarchs will demand not only competence but intuition, the ability to feel the truth of the material world. We discussed the evening's performance meticulously. Zuri's role was to be the invisible judge, the figure everyone was whispering about, but whose true power was silent, contained entirely within the sleeve of her jacket. She was not to panic, not to draw attention, but to trust the evidence of her hands. "The Ellington Gala is a temple to the theoretical," I concluded, giving her a final, piercing look. "Go, Zuri. Do not judge the people. Judge the structure. Learn to honor the subtle language of the material, and you will learn to honor yourself." Zuri arrived at the gala in the dark silk jacket and a simple black gown, a stark, dignified figure in the shimmering landscape of high fashion. Every eye in the room was a needle, piercing the remnants of her reputation. The whispers were loud enough to be heard. The failed architect, the scandal bride, the daughter who almost ruined the Ellingtons. But she held her head high, the weight of the matriarch's lesson firm on her shoulders. She was no longer seeking approval. She was seeking structural equilibrium. She found a quiet corner near the massive chandelier's main anchor points, a subtle architectural flaw that allowed a privileged view of the complex textile suspension. From that vantage point, she was both visible and aloof, the perfect invisible judge. The evening progressed in a blur of clinking glasses, false laughter, and the relentless pulsating rhythm of the live orchestra. Zuri mingled only when absolutely necessary, her focus held captive by the subtle, low-frequency hum emanating from the woven sensors in her sleeve. She was listening to the building breathe, monitoring the slow, inevitable creep of structural dishonesty. The first few hours were quiet. The symphony of wealth and ambition flowed smoothly. The chandelier, a breathtaking dome of white textile and light, held firm, a spectacular crown on the gathering. Zuri's doubt, the inherent uncertainty of the human mind, began to surface. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps the flaw was not so critical. Perhaps the architects had reinforced it then. At precisely the moment the orchestra transitioned to a powerful waltz, the tempo increasing, the density of dancing bodies at its peaks, she felt it. A vibration, subtle but persistent, like the silent buzzing of a single angry hornet trapped beneath the silk lining of her jacket. Her heart leaped. The subtle vibration meant only one thing: the dynamic load of the dancing crowd had reached a threshold that the machine-tensioned cables supporting the chandelier could not absorb. The tension was unevenly distributing, concentrating the force on the weakest anchor points. Material entropy was asserting itself. Zuri closed her eyes, placing her hand instinctively on her sleeve, pressing against the woven sensors. She was no longer Zuri the architect. She was Zuri, the artisan, reading the structure with her hands. The frequency of the vibration was increasing. The structure was failing slowly, silently, invisibly to the untrained eye, but loudly and clearly to the guardian line woven into her jacket. She opened her eyes and scanned the room. No one else noticed. The music was too loud, the champagne too effective. The chandelier remained magnificent, its flaws hidden by the light and the grand scale of the space. She had to act, but without triggering the panic that would compound the disaster. Her timing had to be impeccable, a perfect blend of technical analysis and social diplomacy. She realized the matriarch's lesson. True power lies in knowing the moment of truth before anyone else does. The vibration in Zuri's sleeve intensified, transitioning from a warning buzz to a sustained rhythmic tremor. The structural integrity of the massive chandelier was failing. Not in a spectacular collapse, but in a gradual, irreversible yield, the exact slow-motion tragedy I had predicted for her woven facade. She had minutes, perhaps less, before the structural stress became visible, initiating a stampede that would be far more disastrous than the failure itself. She straightened her shoulders, the instinct to analyze taking over the urge to panic. She was no longer operating under the matriarch's shadow. She was executing the matriarch's will. The crowd had to disperse naturally, immediately. And without realizing they were fleeing a structural disaster, her eyes scanned the room and landed on the conductor of the orchestra, flamboyant, ego-driven artist whose reverence for his own performance was legendary. Zuri knew the power of the spectacle, the emotional control held by the music. She moved with purpose, cutting directly across the dance floor. She ignored the confused stares. Her focus locked on the conductor's raised platform. Mr. Ellington, standing near the punch bowl, watched her approach, a flicker of apprehension on his face. He recognized the determined stride of a woman about to seize control of the narrative. She reached the platform and, without a word, ascended the small staircase. The conductor, mid-crescendo, looked down at her with professional fury, ready to dismiss the interruption. Zuri leaned in close, ensuring only he could hear her voice, which was low, urgent, and perfectly modulated to sound like a professional whisper. Not a hysterical scream. A structural imbalance is building in the textile suspension directly above the platform, Ski whispered, her hand instinctively shielding her sleeve. The dynamic load is causing the cable anchors to yield. You have 15 seconds before the initial visible distortion begins. You must stop the dancing immediately. Not with a shout, but with a moment of awe. The conductor stared at her, then looked nervously up at the majestic, seemingly stable chandelier. His ego demanded he dismiss her, but the sheer unwavering conviction in her voice paralyzed him. He sensed the unspoken authority. "Start the final movement of Beethoven's Fifth," she commanded softly, citing a piece known for its dramatic, immediate shift in tone and volume. The one that demands silence and reverence. Make it an artistic imperative. He stared at her for a moment longer. Then, with the practiced agility of a master performer, he wheeled back to the orchestra. He didn't speak. He simply raised his baton high, then brought it down in a stunning, unexpected cut. The music stopped instantly. Mid-note, the sudden, absolute silence in the massive ballroom was more shocking than any structural collapse could have been. The silence was a palpable, terrifying thing. Every head snapped toward the conductor's platform. Zuri stood beside him, poised and severe, the embodiment of a new, unsettling authority. The entire population of high society was suspended in a moment of pure, awkward confusion. The conductor, following Zuri's instruction, used the silence to project artistic dominance. He didn't explain the interruption. He commanded attention. He slowly raised his baton again, his eyes sweeping the audience, and then, with dramatic, heart-stopping intensity, he struck the first iconic notes of the final movement of Beethoven's Fifth. The music was overwhelming, demanding absolute stillness and focus. The dancing stopped. The conversation ceased. People turned away from the buffet and walked slowly toward the walls, mesmerized by the sheer force of the sound. The dynamic load on the chandelier, which had been dangerously vibrating Zuri's sleeve, immediately dissipated. The weight stabilized, the tension distributed, and the structure, for now, held. Zuri's plan had worked flawlessly. She had evacuated the danger zone using artistic manipulation, The precise kind of abstract theoretical command I had always told her was useless without material honesty. But she had paired the theory with the material knowledge provided by the guardian line in her sleeve. She had seen the truth. And she had used her former tools of manipulation to save lives. She walked off the platform, her mission complete. She had passed the test. She had proven that she could read the structural flaw before it became visible as she stepped away from the platform. She found me waiting in the quiet corner, near the massive columns. I was draped in my charcoal dress, the invisible judge. I said nothing, but my eyes conveyed the depth of my acknowledgement. Zuri, breathing heavily, pulled her hand from her sleeve. The vibration had stopped. It was yielding a fia. I felt the oscillation shift. The machine tension cables couldn't handle the frequency. She spoke not with pride, but with the focused relief of a professional who had averted catastrophe. You honored the material. Zuri, I stated, my voice ringing with final approval. And the material honored you. The emergency averted at the gala was not merely a structural triumph. It was a profound personal vindication. Zuri had successfully wielded the power of the artisan, saving hundreds of lives and, incidentally, Mr. Ellington's reputation, all while operating under the cloak of social shame. The matriarch's will had forced Zuri to internalize the truth I had only spoken at her wedding. The theoretical architect was finally yielding to the practical genius of the seamstress. I watched as Mr. Ellington, oblivious to the near catastrophe, found Zuri in the quiet corner. He didn't offer praise. He offered the only thing he knew: calculation. His eyes were sharp, evaluating the newfound assets Zuri had become. Zuri, he clipped, drawing her away from the remaining guests. The woven facade project needs to move. You need to expedite the stabilization process. Your mother Afia is the key, but she is demanding exorbitant terms for the guild's involvement. He leaned closer, his voice sinking to a confidential, conspiratorial whisper. You are the architect, Zuri. You understand leverage. We need to secure the guardian line formula and the matriarch's hitch technique. Get the knowledge out of the hands of the Seamstresses Guild and into the intellectual property of the Ellington firm. We can compensate your mother fairly, but we cannot afford to be dependent on her guild's artisanal labor for every future project. That reliance is a vulnerability. The temptation was immense. It was the same theoretical shortcut Zuri had taken before. Extract the principle, discard the source, and automate the prestige. This was the true midnight temptation. The test of whether Zuri had truly repented or merely learned to mask her ambition more effectively. I watched from a distance, an invisible judge awaiting the verdict of Zuri's soul. She had witnessed the structural failure of pride at the wedding, and she had felt the structural truth of integrity at the gala. Now, the final blueprint of her loyalty was about to be drawn. Zuri looked at Mr. Ellington, the man who had been her mentor, her future father-in-law, and the embodiment of the corporate ambition she once worshipped. She didn't flinch. Her eyes, still weary from weeks of labor, held a new, unyielding firmness, the matriarch's resolve. The reliance on Afia is not a vulnerability. Mr. Ellington, Zuri stated, her voice quiet but carrying the authority of her recent ordeal. It is the only structural integrity the woven facade has. You cannot digitize wisdom, sir. You cannot automate material honesty. The guardian line is a proprietary material. But the hitch the knots, a manual application based on sensing the material's fatigue point. That knowledge resides in Afia's hands and the hands of her guild, not on your servers. She drew a deep breath and delivered the crushing professional indictment. If you attempt to extract the formula and cut out the guild, the structural flaw will reappear in every building the firm attempts to construct using this technique. You will be building a legacy of visible, repetitive failure. The market will know immediately that you copied the product but couldn't replicate the craftsmanship. She was speaking the matriarch's language, the language of truth and consequence. She had rejected the temptation of the shortcut. Mr. Ellington looked genuinely stunned. He had expected her compliance, her corporate loyalty. He had received a defense of artisanal power. The matriarch's will had officially passed from my mind to my daughter's soul. Mr. Ellington's face, usually so composed, fractured into open calculation. Zuri's resolute defense of the matriarch's power was not emotional. It was delivered as a cold, hard financial reality. He realized that the intellectual property he sought was not a patentable code, but a manual skill set, a legacy guarded by generations of artisanal practice. That was the essence of the betrayal he now faced. Zuri was no longer his corporate apprentice. She was my formidable successor. The board will not tolerate being held hostage by a seamstress's guild, Zuri, he warned, his voice regaining its chilling corporate edge. We will find another way. We will commission new research. You already commissioned the research, sir? Zuri countered, her tone respectful yet absolute. It's the woven facade. And you spend $10 million proving that the cheaper automated method fails. We have 6 months before the current composite begins to visibly ripple. The time for abstract research is over. The time for material honesty is now. She had learned the central lesson. Leverage is not about money. It is about holding the unique key to the solution. The blueprint of betrayal, the reliance on intellectual theft and shortcuts, was unraveling in the face of my daughter's newfound integrity. I stepped out of the shadows, allowing my presence to seal Zuri's argument. The matriarch's will is not about holding anyone hostage, Mr. Ellington. It is about demanding commensurate value. The guild provides the only certified solution to your structural problem. Their price is fair, and their terms the dedication of a permanent studio for the passing. Of this knowledge are the cost of securing your future projects from catastrophic failure. Ellington stared from Zuri to me, seeing his entire future, the reputation of his firm, the solvency of his projects resting precariously on the decision of 2 women dressed in simple silk and charcoal wool. He saw the end of the corporate shortcuts he had always relied upon. He finally gave a terse nod of final surrender. The terms are accepted. The training facility will be established. The guild will be contracted. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the enormous shift in power dynamics. The matriarch's will had not only secured Zuri's repentance, but had forcibly corrected the decades-long exploitation of artisan labor by corporate architecture. Financial vengeance was achieved not through lawsuit, but through indispensability. I then gave Zuri a simple professional instruction. We leave now, Zuri. The real work begins at midnight. We left the Grand Magnolia without another word to Ellington, leaving him standing alone in the remnants of the glittering gala, a defeated king calculating the cost of his surrender. As we walked out into the cool midnight air, Zuri finally spoke, her voice laced with a profound, exhausted relief. I defended Euaphia. I defended the Guardian line. It felt correct. It felt correct because it was the structural truth, Zuri, I affirmed. Truth always provides the firmest foundation. But the night was not over. The matriarch's will had one more personal layer to unfold, one final piece of the blueprint of betrayal that needed to be understood before Zuri's redemption could be complete. We did not go back to the studio. I directed Zuri to drive to a forgotten corner of the city, a small, dark alley behind a row of dilapidated 1940s storefronts. We stopped outside a building marked by a faded sign, Bakari Textiles and Repair. It was the location of my first studio, the cramped, humid space where I had raised Zuri and developed the very techniques she had abstracted into her woven facade. The air in the alley was still and heavy, scented with dust and history. Zuri looked around, a haunted recognition in her eyes. I haven't been here since I left for college. I thought you had sold the building, kept the core of the foundation, Zuri, I said, unlocking the heavy, rusted steel door. You learned to design skyscrapers here. You were playing with the primary composite fibers while I was stitching them. Every line you drew on your first blueprint was an echo of a knot I tied in this very room. We stepped inside. The space was cold and quiet, but preserved the large industrial sewing machine, the cutting table, the shelves lined with spools of thread. It was a physical museum of the legacy she had tried to bury. I led her past the cutting table, towards a small, almost invisible access door tucked behind a shelving unit. I pushed the door open, revealing a short flight of narrow wooden stairs leading down into the darkness. "This is where the blueprint of betrayal truly began," I explained. "This is where your father, my late husband, kept his own secrets." Zuri hesitated, a sudden, cold fear replacing her exhaustion. "Father, what secrets?" "Your father was a brilliant engineer, Zuri," I began, descending the stairs slowly, my voice gaining a profound sadness. "But he was deeply ashamed of the material reality of our lives. He wanted the prestige of being an architect, the high-rise glamour you sought. He scorned the humility of my hands, just as you did." We reached the small basement room. It was dusty and cramped, but organized. On a simple wooden desk lay a thick, leather-bound journal. I pointed to it. "When you were very young, before the accident, your father was obsessed with finding a way to industrialize my guardian line to turn the Matriarch's hitch into a patentable, automated product he could sell to corporate firms like Ellington's. He wanted to claim the technical glory, abstracting my skill away from my hands." Story approached the desk, the betrayal chilling her to the core. "He tried to steal your formula. He tried to steal the soul of the material," I corrected her. "He spent years down here trying to replicate the nonlinear elasticity with machines. He failed, Zuri. Material truth cannot be mass-produced." I picked up the journal and opened it to a marked page. But in his research, he documented his failed attempts. He meticulously recorded all the flaws, all the weaknesses of the machine-tensioned composites, the exact flaws, Zuri, that you unknowingly replicated in the woven facade. I handed her the journal. "You didn't copy my formula. You copied your father's documented failure. The blueprint of your betrayal was actually the blueprint of his. He tried to take a shortcut to status, and you, his daughter, followed the same flawed path." Zuri read the dense, technical handwriting, the documentation of my husband's engineering failure. She saw the precise calculations of stress fatigue, the exact moment the automated composite began to yield, the same moment she had felt in her sleeve at the gala. Her father's shame had become her ruin. The weight of the inherited flaws settled on Zuri's shoulders. The realization that her ambition had been shadowed by her father's unfulfilled pride brought a new, profound wave of understanding. Her betrayal of me was not original. It was a generational repetition of the same core error, attempting to substitute the honesty of the hand for the prestige of the abstract mind. "He didn't tell you," Zuri whispered, looking up from the journal, her eyes filled with a new, complex grief. "He didn't have to," I replied, my voice gentle. I felt the truth in the quiet of the studio. I knew the moment he began to respect the blueprints more than the hands that created them. I pointed to a small sealed wooden box tucked beneath the desk. "When he died, he left that, a final physical testament to his failure and his profound regret." I told her the final truth. "Your father was the original source of the $10 million mistake. Zuri, he sold the incomplete data, his failed research into the machine composite, to a smaller architectural consulting firm before his accident, claiming it was preliminary viable data. That firm eventually sold it to Ellington's competitor, who then sold it to Ellington. Your project was built on a documented failure that began with your father's pride. This was the complete blueprint of betrayal, a generational cycle of shame leading to structural dishonesty. The emotional purpose of the midnight visit was complete. Zuri had to understand that her path to ruin was not an isolated mistake, but an inherited error. Her true redemption had to be generational, correcting not only her mistake, but her father's as well. The matriarch's will, Zuri, I concluded, taking the journal from her hands, demands that you break the cycle. You have saved the building from your father's initial error. Now you must save your own soul from his pride. You must lead the restoration not just of the woven facade, but of the integrity of our legacy." The dawn that broke over the old textile studio was sharp and unforgiving, cutting through the shadows of the basement. Zuri stood by the window, the faint smell of oil and old fabric clinging to her black gala dress. Her face was etched with the exhaustion of a woman who had, in the space of a single night, lost a fiancé, an empire, and the clean narrative of her own success. The matriarch's will had not just broken her, it had forced her to see the true, crushing weight of her inherited pride. She was the fall of the architect personified, a figure of theoretical brilliance brought crashing down by a single physical truth. Her descent, however, was not just professional. It was financial. The Ellington firm, while obligated to contract the guild for the restoration, was not obligated to pay Zuri her partnership bonus or her remaining salary. Her assets tied up in the canceled wedding and the expensive lifestyle required for her social climbing were now liquidating rapidly. "The bankruptcy will be painful, Effia," Zuri said, her voice hollow. "I have nothing left. No firm, no savings, no apartment. The architect is bankrupt. The architect who relied on abstracts is bankrupt." I corrected her, placing a sturdy canvas apron over her delicate dress. "The artisan who understands the value of her hands is never truly bankrupt. Zuri, you have the most valuable asset in this city right now, the exclusive knowledge of the matriarch's hitch. That knowledge is worth more than any corporate partnership." I looked at her, fixing her gaze with my own. The fall is a necessary step. Humility must be earned through poverty of spirit and now poverty of wallet. You scorned the hands that sewed your future. Now those hands must work to mend your present. The contract with Mr. Ellington guarantees the guild's pay, but your wages will be minimal enough for food and a cot here in the old studio. You will work as an apprentice to the very women you sought to abandon. The canvas apron, rough and stained with the honorable history of work, covered the Parisian silk dress she had worn only hours earlier. It was a visual metaphor for the complete inversion of her life. She was forced to trade the theoretical blueprints, her former life, for the material reality of the studio. The first few days were brutal. The seamstresses, Gilda, a formidable group of women, whose hands were as quick and sharp as their tongues, greeted Zuri with a silent, heavy skepticism. They knew her story. They knew she was the daughter who had dismissed their craft as cheap labor. Her atonement had to be earned stitch by stitch, her hands soft and accustomed only to the light touch of a stylus, rebelled against the heavy, continuous turning of the threadmaster. Blisters formed, then broke, leaving red, raw trenches on her palms. The elegant, intellectual Zuri, the architect, was reduced to struggling with the simple task of achieving the perfect, non-linear twist of the guardian line. She cried silently, tears of frustration and exhaustion falling onto the dark red thread. "I can't do this. Effia," she whispered one evening, her voice hoarse. "The precision. It's exhausting. It's impossible to maintain that level of sensory awareness. It is only impossible when the mind is disconnected from the material," I stated, sitting beside her. "You spent years designing buildings that had no feel for the human touch. The matriarch's hitch requires the hand to become the sensor. The nonlinear tension is not a number, Zuri. It is a feeling, the precise moment the carbon fiber yields to the linen composite just before it snaps. You must listen to the material, Zuri. Listen to the thread." I placed her blistered fingers back on the threadmaster. "This is the true cost of the $10 million mistake. It is paid not with abstract funds, but with the sweat of humility." Word count, 1045, 3100. The Fall of the Architect, From Bride to Bankrupt, Part 2 of 6 continues. The initial hostility from the guild slowly began to thaw, replaced by a grudging respect born of shared labor. They watched Zuri's relentless commitment to the work, her refusal to quit despite the pain. They saw the architect, broken and bankrupt, dedicating herself to the very artisanal labor she had scorned. It was the spectacle of genuine repentance. One afternoon, Mama Saad, the oldest and most formidable member of the guild, approached Zuri. Mama Saad had worked alongside me for decades, her hands holding the wisdom of 3 generations of textile engineering. She was the matriarch's true field marshal. The architect's hands are soft, Mama Saad observed, her voice low and critical as she inspected Zuri's bandaged palms. They remember only the easy life. But the matriarchs will demand strength. She did not offer comfort. She offered a critique. You are forcing the thread, child. You are commanding it. The guardian line requires persuasion. It must want to achieve that non-linear twist. You must find the rhythm, the precise moment of yield. The material does not submit to force. It submits to respect. Mama Saad placed a small, worn leather thimble older even than into Zuri's hand. Wear this? It is a gift of necessity, not approval. It will protect your skin, but it will not protect your pride. That you must wear raw. Zuri, who had once bought designer accessories without a thought, accepted the worn leather tool with deep reverence. It was the first true gift of her new life, a tangible sign that she was being initiated into the secret society of the artisans. The matriarch's will was not simply about vengeance. It was about redemption through competence. The real test came a week later. When the first installation crew was ready to begin the stabilization process on the woven facade, Zuri had successfully twisted enough guardian line composite to reinforce the first floor's panels. She was tasked with delivering the material and providing the on-site technical guidance to the installation. Tima, very engineers who had previously worked for her. It was a perfect moment of professional reversal. Zuri, the once celebrated architect, stood on the massive scaffolding, wearing her humble canvas apron, directing the intricate, delicate work of the Seamstresses Guild. The highly paid structural engineers stood below, watching, holding clipboards, forced to defer to the wisdom of the matriarch's apprentice. The work itself was terrifying. Suspended 40 feet in the air, the guild members, nimble and fearless, meticulously threaded the guardian line into the existing composite, performing the matriarch's hitch knot at every anchor point. Zuri's role was crucial. She monitored the real-time tension sensors and directed the placement, ensuring the nonlinear resistance was perfectly uniform across the massive panel. She was the bridge between the theoretical failure and the material solution. The sheer contrast of the scene was a powerful testament to the corrected power dynamic. The steel engineers, used to commanding millions of pounds of concrete, were forced to stand back and watch the quiet, precise work of the seamstresses, whose only tools were needles, thread, and the absolute truth of material structure. One of the engineers, a former colleague of Zuri's who had dismissed my initial analysis at the bridal luncheon, approached her. "Ms. Bakari," he said, his voice laced with forced respect, "the rate of knot application is remarkable. But the tensioning, how do we measure the nonlinear elasticity? The traditional sensors read only uniform stress." Zuri, wearing the worn leather thimble, looked him straight in the eye. She did not reference a textbook or a digital model. She referenced her hands. The nonlinear elasticity is measured by the yield point of the linen composite relative to the carbon fiber. Mr. Davis, it's not a numerical reading. It's a physical sensation. You must feel the thread. The goal is to achieve maximum countertension without snapping the weaker component. The matriarch's hitch is the only knot that can achieve that kinetic balance. She was speaking the language of the matriarch, translating artisanal wisdom into professional, actionable instruction. Her authority was no longer derived from her degree, but from her practiced hands. The restoration progressed with remarkable speed and precision. The guild members, working in coordinated, synchronized rhythm, began to reclaim the integrity of the woven facade. Each completed panel was a tangible victory over Zuri's past pride. The money from the Ellington firm, paid at a premium, flowed directly to the guild, providing financial security and dignity to the community Zuri had abandoned. The matriarch's will was delivering both justice and economic empowerment. However, the final, most terrifying piece of the blueprint of betrayal remained. The original flaw was not just the material. It was the undocumented failure of her father. The final act of Zuri's atonement had to be public, permanent, and etched into the very core of the profession she sought to rejoin. I tasked Zuri with the archival project. She had to go through the entire historical and technical documentation of the woven facade, searching for any final, lingering trace of her father's flawed research that might have been digitized or integrated into the firm's future plans. She was no longer building a building. She was cleaning the archives of generational dishonesty. Zuri spent her evenings in the dusty, quiet solitude of the old studio, poring over the architectural documents and her father's failed journal entries, illuminated only by a single task light. She was searching for a ghostly, abstract data of her father's failure that had survived his death and infected her career. The ultimate betrayal was subtle. Her father, in his final submission of preliminary findings, had inserted a crucial, deliberate ambiguity into the material specification notes, a phrase that made the use of a cheaper, machine-tensioned substitute technically defensible under certain contract provisions. It was a loophole, a tiny legal thread woven into the fabric of the lie. Zuri, as the leading architect on the project, had knowingly capitalized on this ambiguity. One night, Zuri found the precise phrasing in her father's journal, written in a cramped, desperate hand. Nonlinear resistance may be achieved via proprietary material or, where necessary, via machine-tensioned primary composite only when total structural load remains below xkn. The ambiguity lay in the X value, the threshold he knew the machine-made composite could not safely bear. Zuri had disregarded the threshold, seeking profit and speed. She looked up, her eyes wide with the chilling finality of her realization. He knew a FIA. He knew the cheap composite would fail under peak load. He wrote the ambiguity, and I exploited it. We both prioritized the abstract gain over the material truth. The cycle ends now. Zuri, I said, looking away from the documents, toward the single empty mannequin that held the memory of the rejected dress. You must not only fix the structure, but erase the ambiguity. You must permanently sever the lie from the legacy. Her final act was not with a needle, but with a pen. She drafted a complete revision of the woven facade's material specifications, removing all ambiguity. The new technical documentation stated unequivocally, all woven facade components must incorporate the proprietary, hand-tensioned guardian line composite applied via the Matriarch's hitch technique, executed exclusively by certified artisan labor. This document was Zuri's professional masterpiece, a structural truth far more valuable than the glamorous, flawed blueprints she had drawn years ago. It ensured that the Matriarch's will, the principle of material integrity, and the empowerment of the artisan would be enshrined in the Ellington firm's future contracts, forever reversing the cycle of betrayal that had begun with her father's pride. The finalization of the new project specifications was Zuri's official declaration of independence from the cycle of inherited pride. She had faced the ghost of her father's ambition and reversed its structural damage. With the documentation secured, the physical restoration of the woven facade commenced in earnest. The Matriarch's will was now manifest on a grand 40-story scale, with the Seamstresses Guild working in coordinated, synchronized rhythm across the CITYSCAPE. Despite the professional victory and Zuri's newfound commitment to the craft, a profound lingering sadness remained between us. The truth about her father, Kofi, was a deep, unstitched wound. She had learned he was the source of the structural flaw, the originator of the $10 million mistake. But she had never learned his full story, the deeper truth of his ambition, and the source of his profound, desperate regret. I knew that true forgiveness requires full knowledge. The Matriarch's will demanded that Zuri honor the man, even as she corrected the engineer. One afternoon, weeks into the intensive labor, I instructed Zuri to step away from the threadmaster. Her hands, now hardened and skilled, instinctively resisted the break. I guided her back to the cramped basement of the old studio, the small, quiet chamber where Kofi had pursued his flawed genius. The dusty desk was exactly as we had left it. I placed my hand on the sealed wooden box that Kofi had left, the final physical testament to his failure and his profound regret, as I had called it before. "We have addressed the structural fault he left behind," I said, my voice low, carrying the weight of 2 decades of silence. "Now we must address the emotional flaw. The matriarch's will does not allow for unresolved grief." I handed the box to Zuri. It was heavy, plain, and utterly unadorned. "Your father left this for you, Zuri. It contains the blueprint of his soul. The secrets he was too proud to speak while he was alive." Zuri's hands, which could now precisely twist carbon fiber, trembled as they held the wood. She looked at the box, not with the calculating eye of the architect, but with the painful confusion of the daughter. She broke the wax seal and opened the lid inside. Resting on a bed of yellowed, brittle paper were 3 items: a handwritten letter addressed to Zuri, a small, leather-bound journal, not the engineering failure log she had read, but a private diary, a single, heavy spool of thread, not the Red Guardian line, but a thick, coarse, golden yellow wool. Zuri carefully unfolded the letter first, her eyes already swimming with unshed tears. The handwriting was familiar, yet heartbreakingly distant, the hand of the father she had idealized and then recently discovered was flawed. She read aloud, her voice wavering. "My dearest Zuri, if you are reading this, I failed. I failed to be the great man I promised you. And I failed to convince your mother that the language of architecture was superior to the language of her hands. I was always chasing the abstract height, Zuri, and I forgot the strength of the simple foundation. Please forgive my failures. Please never forget the lesson your mother taught you on the sewing table. It is the only real truth we have." The letter contained no technical jargon, no mention of composites or stress loads, just a man's final, raw admission of his emotional bankruptcy. The matriarchs will have forced Zuri to face the financial consequences of his failure. Now she was facing the emotional consequence. Zuri lowered the letter, clutching it against the canvas apron covering her chest. The tears finally fell, washing away the last stubborn remnants of her childhood illusion of the perfect, ambitious father. She had idolized the corporate engineer, the man who dreamed of glass towers, only to discover he was fundamentally human, flawed by the same pride that had nearly ruined her. I allowed her a long moment of silence, the matriarch's wisdom dictating that some grief must be processed alone. Without the intrusion of consolation, she then picked up the small, leather-bound journal. It was not the meticulous engineering log we had found before. This was a diary of the heart. She opened it to a page marked with a single faded flower petal. She read softly. Focusing on a date from 20 years prior, Afia spent the day mending a hole in Zuri's favorite blue dress. She used 3 different colored threads, twisting them together to make a repair so strong and so beautiful, the tear became the best part of the dress. It struck me then, her talent is not in hiding the flaws, but in turning them into a feature. She builds strength not from perfection, but from the deliberate acceptance of the wound. I am trying to build a career from theoretical perfection, and I am empty. She has the secret to structural truth, and I can't even admit that my genius is merely her reflection. The entry revealed the genesis of his flaw. Moment he recognized my genius but chose to deny it, launching his doomed, prideful attempt to automate my work. He was the silent witness to my worth. Yet he allowed his ambition to overshadow his acknowledgement. Zuri closed the journal slowly. He knew Afia, he knew the truth, but he couldn't say it. He chose to honor the abstract idea of architecture over the physical reality of your love. "Pride is a terrible structural flaw, Zuri," I responded, my voice heavy with the understanding of shared loss. "It makes the mind brittle and resistant to the necessary flexibility of truth. Your father, in his ambition, denied the one thing that would have made him a great architect, the humility to learn from the hands that fed him." The matriarch's will had exposed the lineage of the betrayal. Zuri's rejection of me was the echo of her father's internal conflict. Her redemption, therefore, was not merely professional. but familial. The final item in the box, the spool of thick golden yellow wool, lay heavy and unexplained. It was coarse, practical thread, not the fine, specialized material of the Guardian line. Zuri picked it up, curiosity tempering her sorrow. What is this, a fia? It's just simple wool. It's not engineering composite. 'Tis his original legacy thread, Zuri, I explained, my eyes softening as I looked at the simple material. Before your father became obsessed with industrializing my work, before he pursued the grand abstract idea of architecture, he was a structural laborer. He was a master rigger, the men who design and weave the thick, essential mooring lines and safety nets for skyscrapers under construction. They are the unseen structural support, the ones who guarantee the safety of the architects who climb above them. This was the final, profound truth. Kofi was a structural genius, but in the most humble, tangible sense. He was the master of the load-bearing, not the master of the simple, thick, safety-ensuring thread. He had abandoned this foundational skill for the theoretical prestige of the drafting table. This golden wool, I continued, pointing to the spool, was his signature material. He used it for the safety lines on the city's earliest high-rises. He was the most dependable rigger in the city. He could tie a knot that would hold a falling column. That was his genuine genius. Zuri, the skill he shared with me, the truth of the knot. The knot was the intersection of their lives, the shared language that both parents understood. The structural integrity of a life depends on the strength of its connections. Kofi had merely applied it to thick ropes. I had applied it to fine thread. Zuri had applied it to digital blueprints. Zuri finally understood the true irony of her past. She hadn't just rejected me. She had rejected her father's true, humble legacy. The shame she felt for my hands was the same shame her father felt for his own. The matriarch's will demands that this thread, this golden wool, be integrated into the final blueprint, I instructed. Looking at the heavy spool, it cannot be used for the woven facades. Structural stabilization it is too coarse. But it must be woven into the architectural narrative. Your redemption is not complete until you honor his genuine skill. Zuri looked from the golden wool to the fragile, private, understanding the matriarch's final demand. The blueprint of her future had to include both the correction of her father's flaw, the matriarch's hitch, and the honor of his true skill, the legacy thread. How, Afia? How do I honor his work as a rigger in an architectural project that is already stabilized by your guardian line? She asked, seeking the structural truth in the emotional landscape. Your father's genius was in creating safety and visible integrity where there was fear, I explained. The woven facade is a triumph of lightness. But where is the anchor? Where's the statement of confidence? I walked to the corner of the small basement room and pointed to a thick, rusted steel ring bolted into the concrete floor. This ring held his rigging, Zuri. It was his point of absolute confidence. Every structure requires an anchor of truth. The matriarch's will demands that the legacy thread, the golden wool of your father's honest work, be woven into the architectural narrative in a permanent, visible way. You will use the final payment from the Ellington contract to establish a new architectural feature, an educational tribute, a statement of humility and origin. This was the final piece of the financial vengeance and the ultimate act of familial justice. Zuri had been forced to pay the price of her pride, and now that payment would be used to immortalize the honest labor she and her father had both scorned. The golden wool would be the final, visible stitch in the healing of the matriarch's legacy. The true foundation of any structure is not the concrete slab beneath it, but the honesty woven into its very first component. Forgiveness, like architecture, is not an act of erasure. It is an act of rebuilding and acceptance of the flaw, followed by the painstaking labor required to reinforce the broken joint. Zuri, holding the coarse, golden wool of her father's legacy, finally understood that her professional task was inseparable from her personal penance. She had to forgive the lie she perpetuated by honoring the truth her father had tried and failed. To hide the next phase of the Matriarchs will focus entirely on the reconciliation of this generational flaw. The physical repair of the woven facade continued flawlessly, a testament to the dedication of the Seamstresses Guild. The structural flaw was being meticulously mended inch by inch, with the disciplined application of the Matriarch's hitch. But Zuri's work now extended beyond the scaffolding. Her task was to design the legacy anchor, a permanent architectural feature within the Ellington Tower lobby that would house and explain the Golden Wool Kofi's legacy and acknowledge the Guild's role. It had to be a statement of profound, unyielding humility, visible to every visitor, every investor. Every architect who passed through the tower's gilded doors, Zuri returned to her drafting table. But this time, the process was entirely inverted. She did not start with abstract concepts or digital renderings. She started with the material, the golden wool, the carbon linen guardian line, and the physical constraints of the lobby space. Her mind, once obsessed with height and scale, was now grounded in texture, tension, and the tactile honesty of the fiber. She designed a massive, museum-quality installation, a wall of polished dark wood, within which 5 parallel steel cables would be tensioned. Woven between these cables, in the intricate, load-bearing knots of her father's rigger work, would be the golden wool. It would not be decorative. It would be demonstrative of visual, didactic display of material honesty versus abstract concept. I watched her work, my heart swelling with the quiet pride only a matriarch understands. She was using her full architectural genius, but now it was directed towards honoring humility, not escaping it. The design was stark, powerful, and utterly uncompromising in its message. The installation was titled, "The Unseen Anchor." The unveiling of the unseen anchor was scheduled for the final structural certification of the woven facade. Mr. Ellington, eager to publicly close the book on the structural scandal, agreed immediately to the installation's design and funding, viewing it as a shrewd piece of public relations and narrative of corporate learning from a technical oversight. He still saw it as a business transaction, a necessary cost of doing business. But Zuri and I knew the truth. The installation was an eternal monument to the matriarch's will, a visible scar reinforcing the necessity of honesty. Zuri and the Seamstresses Guild worked together on the final execution of the lobby feature. Zuri oversaw the structural rigging, applying the complex, load-bearing knots of her father's trade skill she painstakingly learned by studying his journal entries and practicing with Mama Saad. Her hands, once incapable of twisting a simple thread, now commanded thick steel cables and rough wool with masterful precision. The Guild, using the finest guardian line, wove the precise, counter-tensioning matriarch's hitch knots into the structural display, demonstrating the invisible integrity that held the 40-story tower together. The resulting installation was a stunning blend of masculine strength, the steel and the rigger knots, and feminine resilience, the fine guardian line knots, a permanent reconciliation of Zuri's parents, the engineer and the artisan, as the final piece was installed. Zuri stepped back, viewing her work not as a theoretical architect, but as the artisan who understood the full measure of her responsibility. It is not a memorial. Afia, Zuri observed, her voice low. It is a cautionary principle. Every architect who walks into this lobby will be forced to confront the hands that saved their building. You have done well, Zuri, I said, finally allowing a small, genuine smile. The lie is forgiven because the foundation has been rebuilt with truth. The fall of the architect has created the integrity of the artisan. The public certification ceremony was held directly beneath the woven facade. Mr. Ellington stood on the podium, flanked by the lead structural engineers ready to deliver the polished, corporate narrative of resilience and quality assurance. I stood at the edge of the crowd, dressed in my simple dark charcoal, the matriarch observing the final payment of the debt. The most powerful statement of the day, however, was not delivered from the podium. It was delivered from the scaffold, before the speeches began. Zuri, still wearing her canvas apron, descended the final section of the restoration scaffold. She walked directly to the podium, not as the disgraced bride, but as the chief project artisan. The crowd, including the journalists who had documented her fall, watched in rapt silence. Mr. Ellington looked surprised, but ceded the platform to her. He was learning that the matriarchs will always dictate the final narrative. Zuri looked out at the assembled crowd, the investors, the rivals, the curious public. Her voice was strong, carrying the resonance of a woman who had faced her shame and mastered it. The restoration of the woven facade is complete, she announced, and its success is a testament not to technological innovation, but to material honesty. The structural flaw we encountered was severe, and its correction required a specific proprietary technique that originated not in a laboratory, but in the hands of the Seamstresses Guild. She then did the unthinkable. She spoke her father's truth publicly. The original material specification was based on a flawed premise and error that began with a lie of ambition, perpetuated by my late father's desire to automate the genius of my mother, Afia Bakari. I, the architect, knowingly perpetuated that lie for profit and prestige. The crowd shifted, shocked by the brutal honesty. This was not corporate spin. This was public confession. My hands, which once scorned the needle, have spent the last 6 months learning the matriarch's hitch to only not capable of stabilizing this structure. My debt is not to Mr. Ellington, but to the women of the guild, whose honest labor saved this city's skyline. She turned and extended her hand to Mama Saad, who stood proudly beside the scaffold. Mama Saad stepped forward and accepted the handshake, a gesture that symbolically transferred ownership of the success from the corporate abstract back to the artisanal reality. The handshake between the disgraced architect and the lead artisan was the photograph that defined the entire scandal and its resolution. It was a visible, undeniable statement that the foundation had been rebuilt with integrity. The matriarch's will had forced the corporate world to acknowledge the source of its strength. Zuri concluded her speech with the final structural truth. The new technical documentation enshrines this reality, the matriarch's hitch, and the continuous oversight of the artisan community is now a permanent, non-negotiable component of all woven facade construction. Our future buildings will be built not only on glass and steel, but on the enduring strength of the needle and thread. Mr. Ellington, reading the room, realized the profound public goodwill Zuri's honesty had generated. He stepped forward, putting his corporate stamp on the new narrative. He announced the full funding and establishment of the Matriarch's studio, the permanent training facility I had demanded, to be headed jointly by myself and Mama Saad. The announcement was met with thunderous, genuine applause. The final element of the ceremony took place in the lobby. Zuri stood by the unseen anchor, the architectural feature she had designed to honor her father. The golden wool, woven in his complex, load-bearing knots, shone under the gallery lights. I approached her. The blueprint is complete, Zuri. You have forgiven the lie by honoring the truth of the laborer. She reached out, her hands hardened by work, and placed her thimble, the worn leather one from Mama Sodine, to the small dedication alcove on the unseen anchor. It was a silent, permanent oath to her new foundation. The reconciliation was complete, structured not by sentiment, but by shared work and mutual respect. The matriarch's will had ensured that Zuri's failure became the cornerstone of a new, ethical, professional life. As we left the tower, the setting sun catching the now stabilized woven facade, Zuri spoke the final personal truth I had been waiting for. Thank you, Afia. You didn't just save my career. You taught me that my greatest strength was never in the height of the building, but in the depth of the stitch. She reached for my hand. Her hands, still rough, were now firm, confident, and utterly honest. I squeezed her hand, the matriarch's silent acknowledgement that the foundation of our bond was finally secure. The cycle of shame was broken, replaced by the enduring legacy of the thread. The matriarch's will had achieved its full structural integrity. The tower was stabilized, the corporate lie was dismantled, and Zuri had found the honesty of the hands she had scorned. But the final, enduring testament to this victory could not be a monument of steel and glass. It had to be a monument of continuous, dignified labor. The matriarch's studio was not merely a training facility promised in a contract. It was the ultimate act of financial vengeance, ensuring that the community Zuri had abandoned would hold permanent, unassailable power over the city's architectural future. The process of establishing the studio was the final, satisfying reversal of Zuri's corporate life. She became my chief project manager, navigating the complexities of commercial real estate and supply chains. But now she did so for the benefit of the Seamstresses Guild, not the Ellington shareholders. Her formidable, organized mind, once focused on maximizing profit margins, is now dedicated entirely to maximizing dignity and artisanal empowerment. She ensured the studio, located in a bustling, easily accessible part of the city, far from the shadows of the old alley, was designed not as a humble workshop, but as a cathedral of craft. It featured soaring ceilings, vast windows that flooded the space with light, and state-of-the-art machinery complemented by dedicated areas for traditional hand-tensioning work. It was a space that commanded respect, designed to elevate the perception of textile engineering to the level of abstract architecture. "We are not hiding our work anymore," Afia Zuri explained one afternoon, her eyes shining as she reviewed the interior designs. "We are displaying our power. Every young person who walks in here will see the true value of the hands, disconnected from the shame of poverty. This is where we weave pride." The name itself, the Restoration Studio, was chosen deliberately. It signified not just the repair of fabric, but the repair of lives, legacies, and professional ethics. The financial resources extracted from the Ellington contract and my negotiation with Mr. Ellington provided not just funding, but an untouchable multi-generational endowment. The matriarchs will have successfully transferred power from the boardroom to the cutting table. The opening day of the Restoration Studio was a quiet, powerful affair, intentionally devoid of the corporate fanfare Zuri once craved. There were no champagne toasts, only the quiet, focused sound of 20 sewing machines humming in unison, a rhythmic, powerful declaration of industry. The guild members, Mama Saad chief among them, walked into the pristine, light-filled space with a palpable sense of ownership and dignity. They were no longer working in humid basements. They were commanding a professional institution. Zuri and I stood at the center of the floor, watching the guild women take their places. Zuri's face, softened by labor and humility, was radiant. She had paid her debt, and in doing so, had found her true professional foundation. The studio immediately became the architectural world's most unlikely hub of innovation. Structural engineers and major contracting firms, including, inevitably, the Ellingtons, now depended entirely on the Restoration Studio for the specialized Guardian line and the application of the Matriarch's hitch. The power dynamic had flipped completely. The Matriarch Studio dictated terms, set prices, and ensured that artisanal knowledge was compensated at the premium rate of structural necessity. I focused on the teaching, passing on the sensory knowledge. It's the ability to feel the truth of the material. Mama Saad taught the practical, high-volume skills. And Zuri became the Director of Advanced Material Specification and Corporate Liaison. Her role was crucial. She translated the language of the matriarch's hitch into the language of structural schematics, writing the technical standards that the entire industry now had to obey. This was the complete inversion of her previous life. Zuri, the once abstract architect, now served as the bridge, permanently fusing the honesty of the guild with the demands of the corporate world. Her greatest skill was not in designing buildings, but in designing ethical systems. One afternoon, Mr. Ellington himself visited the studio unannounced. He didn't come to negotiate, he came to observe. He found Zuri, now constantly wearing her sturdy leather thimble, patiently instructing a group of young apprentices on the proper tensioning of the guardian line. She looked up and greeted him, not with bitterness or subservience, but with quiet, professional authority. Mr. Ellington, Zuri acknowledged, without interrupting her lesson. Your latest contract proposal arrived this morning. We are reviewing the material specifications to ensure compliance with the Matriarch standards. Ellington, the corporate titan, watched his former star architect, now covered in carbon dust, commanding the space with absolute competence. He realized that the Matriarch's will had achieved something far more valuable than a technical fix. It had created a new, indispensable structural authority that his firm could no longer bypass. He approached me, standing by the old threadmaster. Mrs. Bakari, he conceded, the formality gone. You didn't just teach my son and my firm a lesson in materials. You corrected a generational arrogance. The foundation must always be honest, Mr. Ellington, I replied, my hands working steadily. The Matriarch's will ensures that the source of structural truth is never scorned again.